Today we will discuss in detail verse 10 of Canto 1, Sutra Patanika Varnanam of the Maharamayana. Welcome to this explainer. You know, as a seeker of wisdom, you've probably come across texts that totally challenge your fundamental understanding of reality. But honestly, very few do it as elegantly and as systematically as the Yoga Vashistha, which is often called the Maharamayana. So today, we're not just going to skim the surface. We're really going to deeply analyze a single, incredibly profound verse that literally sets the stage for one of the greatest philosophical dialogues in human history.
To start our deep dive into this ancient text, we need to approach this wisdom just as a disciple would approach a guru. If you take a look at the scholarly foundation we have here, you'll see we aren't relying on hearsay or loose translations. We're looking directly at the precise Sanskrit terminology, words that carry centuries of spiritual weight. It's absolutely crucial that we anchor ourselves right in the source material, because every single syllable in these verses holds a highly specific psychological and philosophical meaning.
Our journey today is going to take us through a sort of concentric unveiling. We'll start with number 1, the sacred verse unveiled. Then 2, unpacking the Sanskrit words. 3, spiritual and philosophical depth. 4, modern science and psychology. 5, practical application in life. And finally, 6, summary and next steps.
All right, let's jump straight into section 1, the sacred verse unveiled.
So found right on page 4 of the original text in the Vairagya Prakaranam, verse 10 sequentially introduces us to the story of Karunya. Now, Karunya is the son of the great sage Agnivesya, and at this exact moment in the narrative, he's just finished up his rigorous spiritual education. He spent years in this highly isolated, incredibly pure environment of an ashram, basically just absorbing the highest absolute truths of the universe. And the text here gives us the exact moment his formal education ends and his real-world test actually begins.
The original Sanskrit shloka reads, Goro adita vidya, sana ajagama griham prati. Now, the simple literal English meaning of this verse is, having learned and mastered the sciences and knowledge from his guru, he returned towards his home. On the surface, that sounds pretty mundane, right? It just sounds like a standard graduation story. A student finishes school and heads back home. But in the context of Vedic scripture, this physical movement from the isolated forest ashram back to the household represents a colossal psychological transition.
Moving on to section 2, unpacking the Sanskrit words.
First up, we have the word guru. This tells us that his knowledge wasn't just self-taught, it was authentically and humbly received from a qualified master. You see, in the Vedic tradition, a guru isn't just some academic lecturer. The word itself actually implies being the dispeller of darkness. Karunya received this knowledge through intense discipline, direct transmission, and deep reverence. This means the wisdom he's carrying is pure, tested, and absolute.
Next is ahita vidya. This phrase is key because it shows Karunya didn't just learn a little bit or barely pass a test, he fully mastered the theoretical sciences and the highest Vedic scriptures. The term vidya encompasses both worldly sciences and transcendent spiritual knowledge. He's essentially brimming with the absolute truths of the universe. His intellect is incredibly sharp and his grasp of spiritual philosophy is just unmatched.
Finally, we look at the phrase ajagama griham prati. This signifies his physical return to worldly life after finishing his isolated spiritual incubation in the ashram. But here's the thing, the griha, or the home, isn't just a physical building. It represents society, duty, family obligations, and the whole tangled web of worldly actions. He's literally stepping out of the sanctuary of pure thought and walking right into the messy, demanding arena of daily life.
So with that literal etymology clear, we need to pause for a second. We really have to ask ourselves, what kind of profound crisis happens when a student brings vast, purely theoretical knowledge back into the mundane world? Think about it. If he knows deeply that the ultimate reality is formless and detached, how is he supposed to care about washing the dishes, managing a household, or doing societal duties? This is exactly where the narrative shifts into some really deep philosophy.
Which brings us to section 3, spiritual and philosophical depth.
Philosophically speaking, this verse represents a massive pivotal moment. It's when the mind, completely saturated with absolute spiritual concepts, struggles to reconcile them with the relative, everyday demands of worldly action, which is also known as karma. Imagine knowing at your core that the physical world is temporary, ultimately an illusion. How do you then motivate yourself to actually participate in it? This is the classic conflict between jnana, pure knowledge, and karma, action, and Karunya is stuck right at this exact crossroads.
This brilliantly illustrates the dichotomy of his existence. As the commentary in the original Sanskrit text explains, Karunya enters a state of deep, paralyzing doubt, a state called samsaya. Just look at the stark contrast between these two states. In the Gurukula, the ashram, he was in pure absorption, totally isolated from daily friction. But back in the griha, the home, he's forced into the realm of karma. Because his mind can't bridge the gap between the absolute truth of non-attachment and the practical necessity of doing his daily chores, he falls into a state of silent inaction. He basically just stops functioning. And this foundational conflict is the central premise that sets up the entire Yoga Vashistha.
Let's look at Section 4, Modern Science and Psychology.
You know, what makes the Maharamayana so incredibly timeless is that this ancient existential crisis beautifully mirrors concepts we study right now in modern science. Today, modern psychology would refer to Karunya's state of mind as cognitive dissonance, or maybe analysis paralysis. Cognitive dissonance happens when a person holds contradictory beliefs, in his case the spiritual belief of detachment crashing into the physical necessity of worldly action. And analysis paralysis happens when acquiring immense amounts of theoretical data actually halts a person's ability to just take practical action. Karunya is so overwhelmed by the vastness of what he knows that he literally cannot figure out how to act in a normal, everyday setting.
Scientifically, when the human brain gets overloaded with abstract, absolute truths, it really struggles to compute relative, everyday tasks. We see this all the time today, right? High intellectualism can very often lead to total inaction. Theory, when it isn't integrated through practice, creates deep anxiety. The brain simply cannot map a concept like universal oneness onto the task of paying the bills. This gap between knowing and doing creates a complete behavioral freeze. Karunya, this absolutely brilliant student, has effectively short-circuited upon coming home.
And that leads perfectly into Section 5, Practical Application in Life.
Because understanding the problem is only half the journey, right? The practical application is absolutely crucial here. The text is sending us a clear warning. Do not let profound knowledge become an excuse for apathy or inaction. Authentic spiritual wisdom shouldn't make us abandon our worldly responsibilities. Actually, it should empower us to perform those very duties with greater clarity, way less stress, and profound detachment. True mastery isn't tested in the quiet of an ashram, it's tested in the noise of the home, out in the real world. Action, karma, and knowledge, jnana, are basically like two wings of a bird. They have to work together for us to fly.
Let's wrap things up with Section 6, Summary and Next Steps. Let's summarize this profound narrative essence before we look at what comes next in the scripture. In short, verse 10 sequentially sets the stage for the ultimate human dilemma. We're watching Karunya return from the absolute heights of learning, only to find himself totally paralyzed by the heavy burden of that very knowledge. Ironically, his profound education has made him completely unfit for daily living, simply because he hasn't yet figured out how to integrate his theory with practice. So let's look at the narrative connection and see how this builds. This specific moment logically connects directly to the very next verse in the text. Karunya's father, the sage Agnaveshya, observes his son's sudden apathy. He sees his boy sitting silently, neglecting all of his household and spiritual duties, entirely frozen in this psychological crisis. So in verse 11, which follows immediately on this page, the father breaks the silence. He begins to question him, and that sparks the great discourse on how to balance supreme knowledge with worldly action.
This leaves us with a highly provocative thought to ponder as we wrap up our analysis of verse 10. Is knowledge a tool that liberates us, or is it a weight that binds and paralyzes us until we truly learn how to apply it in the real world? It's a massive question, and it resonates just as deeply today as it did thousands of years ago. On behalf of the Vedmata AI family, if you found our presentation informative, please share our video as widely as possible so that the authentic knowledge of Indian Vedic texts can reach the masses. Come, let us all participate in this yagya of knowledge. Har Har Mahadev.